Welcome to the Sustainability Nugget podcast. I am Rarasu Maraibi.
And I'm Tosin Folorunsho.
On this podcast, we learn about sustainability by discussing various related topics while focusing on three pillars: the economy, the society, and the environment. Hello guys, welcome back to another episode on the Sustainability Nugget podcast. On today's episode, I'll be speaking with Professor James Van Nostrand. He's the director of the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development and also a professor of law at the West Virginia University. On this episode, we'll be discussing the clean energy revolution in the United States, particularly its drivers, and the political and cultural factors affecting the clean energy economy. Without further ado, let's jump right into today's episode. Professor James, thanks so much for being here on the Sustainability Nuggets podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
So let's start off with you introducing yourself to the audience and telling us more about your role.
Yes, I'm James Van Nostrand. I'm a professor of law at the West Virginia University College of Law, and I also direct our Center for Energy and Sustainable Development.
Yeah, so how did you get into this field? Like, of course, you just said you're a professor of law, but you're really also into clean energy. So what was the route? How did you get interested and involved in the clean energy space?
I practiced energy law for, over 30 years. After I graduated law school, I took a job with the New York Public Service Commission in Albany and learned all about regulating investor-owned utilities. And then I moved to Seattle, Washington, and for 22 years, I represented energy companies primarily in electric and natural gas retail rate proceedings in front of all the PUCs around. I did cases in front of 8 different PUCs. Then around 2008, I started transitioning into law school teaching. I got my environmental law degree and an LLM, which is a master's in law degree at Pace University in White Plains, and then directed an environmental NGO at Pace while I was there, the Pace Energy and Climate Center, just working on clean energy issues. And then in 2011, I took a job to come to West Virginia and get a tenure track position at WVU. And then also opened up the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development, which is where I've been for the last 11 years.
Awesome. Talking about the clean energy revolution in the United States, what really are the drivers of this revolution right now?
I'd say for the past 10, 15 years, it's been really market forces in terms of those regions of the country that were heavily dependent upon coal have been hit disproportionately hard because there are just cheaper ways to generate electricity now. First, there was the natural gas. Once we started developing fracking and horizontal drilling and the ability to extract mass quantities of natural gas from shale. So we've got just natural gas prices came down, cheap and plentiful natural gas, technological advances in terms of combined combustion turbines combined cycle combustion turbines, which used to generate electricity from natural gas. So the prices really came down in terms of being able to generate electricity with natural gas. Then the last few years, it's been wind and solar. So lots of decarbonization has been happening in the energy sector just because natural gas, wind, and solar are cheaper ways to generate electricity than coal. So it's been a lot of just technological advances. And then there's some pretty aggressive state energy policies. Until recently, we haven't done much at the national level, but there's a lot of states that have adopted very aggressive clean energy goals. We've got probably a dozen states now that have adopted zero net carbon standards by 2045 or 2050. So policies are being put in place in states to drive further decarbonization. And then more recently, we've got the Inflation Reduction Act enacted in August that provides some incentives at the federal level for decarbonization, renewables, nuclear, hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration. So now we finally have some things going on at the federal level to sort of drive that additional decarbonization.
Oh, awesome. So how would you say the clean energy economy in the United States is actually faring when compared to other countries?
I don't think we're moving as rapidly as we need to. We're doing better than some countries, not as good as other countries. We had a 4-year hiatus when Donald Trump was president, who didn't, pulled us out of the Paris Climate Agreement and didn't really believe that climate change was an issue that needed to be addressed. So we took a little bit of a pause there. Now I think the United States is fully engaged again. And I think, we've done pretty well, mostly through market forces. Like I say, it's been just technological advances that have made generating electricity with wind and solar cheaper than using coal. But now I think we need to take more aggressive actions to do our part in terms of achieving the necessary reductions in greenhouse gases to keep, temperatures at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And right now we're at 1.2. So it's getting serious.
So I know we're talking about the US, but like if we really want to know how we can go further, we need to look outside, right? So what country do you consider like the golden child, like the best in clean energy right now? And really, what do you think is making them so successful?
Well, just there are a lot of countries in Europe, I think, that have got a pretty spectacular record, and the Scandinavian countries in particular. And I guess among them, I would probably identify Sweden as being probably the most impressive in terms of decarbonization. They get about 75% of their electricity from non-carbon sources. So hydroelectric, and they have a lot of nuclear plants. They also get about 16% from wind power. So they're a long way towards fully decarbonized, and they're trying to have a net zero carbon economy by 2045. They're doing a lot of right things and correct things in terms of public policies. Like they put a price on carbon. Carbon pricing had the highest carbon price in the world, and that sends a really strong signal to decarbonize. It makes renewables and nuclear more cost competitive, so it's been a big driver. They also have pretty good use of combined heat and power, which is fueled by biofuels rather than we tend to fire combined heat and power in the United States with natural gas, but Sweden actually uses biofuels. So combined heat and power is when you're actually generating electricity, and then you're actually using the heat that's a byproduct of generating electricity for some other purpose, like heating and cooling buildings. And so they've got a lot of combined heat and power in Sweden as well. So that's probably the country I'd point to. But there's other good examples in the other Scandinavian countries, Norway and Denmark, and they're also pretty impressive in terms of clean energy policies.
Awesome. So like we can see that some other countries, like you said, Sweden is really ahead, and this is because they're really implementing like certain policies and all. And so we can say like maybe cultural differences might be one of the reasons why other countries are not adopting as fast. So how do cultural factors actually hinder different states and countries from adopting the right policies?
Well, that's the issue that's definitely a predominant one in West Virginia, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book that was just published by Cambridge University Press, The Coal Trap, which really does talk about West Virginia, and there are some other states. Wyoming comes to mind, Kentucky, Indiana. There are other states in the United States that have a long history of coal mining. The Appalachian states in particular, I think they would take credit to, gee, we industrialized the United States on the backs of the Appalachian coal miners. And so it's a source of great pride. And for many decades, it was it employed tens of thousands of people. And then we had, mechanized mining and mountaintop removal. So the number of miners employed declined, but coal production remained high. But there's just, it's a great source of pride in West Virginia, and that's one of the reasons I called my book The Coal Trap, because it's been really hard because of those cultural connections to move away from coal. It's almost seen as unpatriotic if you suggest burning less coal and using wind or solar or natural gas instead. Then it's made it a challenge in terms of talking about a transition in West Virginia, because people just don't want to let go of that coal legacy.
At the beginning of the call, you talked about how it's now cheaper, like the cleaner energy. So them not wanting to go away from coal, how really is it affecting like their economics, like, and the environmental status of the energy structure in those states?
Yeah, it's been a huge issue in terms of our regulators in West Virginia. The West Virginia Public Service Commission is really not pushing the utilities towards the cheaper sources of electricity. I mean, I think my book really focuses on the years 2009 to 2019, which I refer to as the lost decade, because that's when the shale gas revolution really took off and really made coal relatively uneconomical as a means of generating electricity. It's also when Obama became president, and so we had more attention focused on environmental issues. And so in West Virginia, a lot of the problems in the coal industry, rather than acknowledging their market forces, were blamed on Obama's job-killing EPA. But at the state level, we've also had the utilities continue to burn coal. They're continued to be urged or even required by our regulators to continue to burn coal, even though natural gas has been cheaper for probably the last 12 years. And even though wind and solar is now cheaper, the regulators are actually putting pressure on the utilities to keep burning coal at historical levels. And that's caused our electricity prices to go up pretty dramatically. The numbers I calculated for my book between 2008 and 2020, which roughly corresponds to the lost decade, our electricity prices in West Virginia on average grew at an annual rate 5 times greater than the national average, because most of the other states have figured it out. It's cheaper to generate electricity with natural gas, wind, or solar, and they've diversified the electricity supply. And there's a prominent role for energy efficiency. And in West Virginia, we've clung to coal. We are still 91% coal fired as of the end of 2021, 91%.
Wow.
And nationally, that figure has gone down from 48% in 2008 to less than 20% now. But we're 91% coal fired, and we have electricity rates to show for it in terms of just massive rate increases that are imposed on our consumers. And we're a relatively poor state. We can't afford it, but the Public Service Commission seems to think they have their mission is to protect the coal industry rather than to protect ratepayers. So that's where we are.
Yeah, so I think I'll play like devil's advocate, or rather just ask a question. Like you talking about this now reminded me of a podcast I listened to earlier in the year, and it was about co-workers. It was like a documentary but on a podcast, and it really captured some of the co-workers actually losing their job and no option being given to them. I know that, like, yeah, it's more expensive. Clean energy is cheaper, yeah, but how do you protect the current workers from not losing their job? Like, how do you give them an alternative even in this clean energy space? Because if you just put in policies to cut down, are you actually creating opportunities for these people whose career has just been like in this space? How do you think we can actually go? What's the route we can take to make sure we're actually having a win-win situation and not just like, oh, saying we're going to a cleaner energy and not caring about families who like depend on that industry for their livelihood?
That's a great question, and it's a big challenge, because generally the clean energy jobs do not pay as well as the coal mining jobs. I mean, the kids in West Virginia, they can go into a coal mine right out of high school and make about $85,000 a year. And right now we have fewer than 12,000 coal miners in the state of West Virginia, down from maybe 140,000 a few years in the middle of the 20th century. And so that challenge is referred to as a just transition, making sure that no one gets left behind. And and now I think we've got a lot of resources devoted to it. That Inflation Reduction Act, for example, the $370 billion clean energy bill that got passed in August, they have an incentive for energy communities. So if you're in an energy community that's been disproportionately impacted by fossil fuel transition, like a coal mine closed down or a coal plant closed down, or you have a generally higher unemployment rate, or it's a former brownfield site, there's a 10% incentive on your tax credits and tax incentives to invest in energy communities. And if you look at a map of West Virginia right now and Resources for the Future, RFF, and Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, they've created a map of energy communities around the country. Pretty much the entire state of West Virginia qualifies as an energy community. And that's a big deal in terms of additional tax incentives. Another thing in the Inflation Reduction Act is in order to take full advantage of the tax credits, you have to pay a prevailing wage. And so that addresses the issue of these jobs need to be well-paying jobs. There's another requirement on apprenticeships that a certain percentage of your workforce has to be in an apprentice program. So you're dealing with that transition issues, the retraining of fossil fuel workers. And so in order to take full advantage of the tax credits, you have to meet those requirements in terms of prevailing wage and apprenticeship programs. Those are really good programs for West Virginia to address those just transition issues. And also the Biden administration, some of the it still carries the moniker Build Back Better, but there's some pretty generous grants programs that are available targeted at coal communities, targeted at energy communities. And so there's a recognition that we need to do a lot in terms of retraining fossil fuel workers for these clean energy jobs, not to not leave anybody behind.
Awesome. I know you've talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, like the tax credit also comes under that. But like, can you just, like, for someone that doesn't know what the Inflation Reduction Act is, can you just explain the overview of that act, right?
Yeah, it's probably the biggest piece of legislation addressed to climate change that we've ever passed. It's sort of morphed from, the Build Back Better started off as 6.5 or 6 trillion dollars and whittled down to 3.5, whittled down to 1.7, down to 900 billion. And once Senator Manchin finally got done chopping it down, we ended up with about $370 billion. But it provides continues the incentives for renewables, and then in a couple of years, basically we have the tax incentives for renewables, and along with renewables, we also have hydrogen and nuclear and carbon capture and sequestration, basically treating all these potentially zero carbon resources, put them on equal footing. And so it's not just renewables, but it's also going to be looking at, carbon capture and sequestration for those industries where you can't necessarily substitute electricity for burning coal or natural gas for the heat in the industrial processes. There might still be some uses for fossil fuels, so we're going to have to focus on carbon capture and sequestration to be able to decarbonize that. It recognizes the nuclear because it's a zero carbon resource to generate electricity. It provides baseload generation. Let's incentivize that. Hydrogen plays a role as well in terms of potentially firming up, wind and solar intermittent resources. You have to have some technology to store the energy. So we're exploring hydrogen as a fuel to do that. So there's just a lot of measures there, lots of energy efficiency. West Virginia has a pretty poor track record on energy efficiency. The utilities providing energy efficiency programs to help consumers manage their energy costs. Lots of assistance in there, lots of grants in the Inflation Reduction Act for energy efficiency. And also in the transportation sector, in both that bill and the infrastructure bill that got passed last November, lots of incentives for electric vehicles, charging stations, because right now the transportation sector is the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions. So we've moved beyond, used to be generating electricity, but now with the decarbonization, with coal plants closing down, it's now the transportation sector. So we really have to take aim on that. And the way you do that is electrifying the transportation system with electric vehicles. And so lots of tax incentives and incentives for the infrastructure with charging stations to allow that to happen. And additional monies for the transmission grid, because once you electrify the transportation system and once you encourage homeowners to stop using natural gas for space and water heating and use electric heat pumps instead, you're putting a lot more electrical loads on the grid. And frankly, the grid can't handle it. So there's billions of dollars in there for grid modernization to basically move more electricity over longer distances around the country, because that's what we're going to need in order to fully decarbonize the electric grid.
Yeah, great. Right now, incentives are really, really important to push like the renewable energy agenda, the clean energy, because like over the summer, you mentioned EDF. I was actually an EDF Climate Core member over the summer where I worked, like I consulted for a company. And like, yeah, in that experience, I realized that like if there were no incentives like in the state for like energy efficiency, the IAM managers, like the management up, were not really interested in doing anything. But if they see incentives, then it's not all companies are like so climate conscious who want to save the environment, but when it does good, when there's like an incentive, when there's a tax credit, then they're ready. So I really am like the believer of, I believe in climate change. Yeah, that I'm passionate about it. That's what I'm researching or whatever. But I really believe we need to push the economics to make like it will no longer even be like, oh, is climate change real or not real? It will be, it's better for my business. It saves me more money, and that way we can actually help push the agenda properly. So yeah, I really feel this Inflation Reduction Act will really help facilitate the renewable energy transition.
And
So
you probably saw in that job that it's fairly uneven across the states. I mean,
mhm,
there are some states like Massachusetts, New York, California, Oregon, Washington, Illinois, kind of the usual suspects, as we would say, in terms of blue progressive states, that very aggressive
mhm,
incentives in terms of energy efficiency, renewables, decarbonization. And then you got a lot of states, and West Virginia is certainly in there, that just really have no policies whatsoever
mhm,
at the state
yeah,
level.
sure.
We just, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, ACEEE, they do the state scorecard in terms of how much do you promote energy efficiency in your state. Well, West Virginia comes in 48th
Wow.
because our utilities have no energy efficiency programs.
Yeah, that's bad.
So even though our residential bills right now our rates are the 18th lowest, there are 35 other states that have lower bills because we have drafty houses that haven't been insulated. And so we have relatively low rates, but relatively high bills because our utilities don't offer energy efficiency programs compared to most other states. They
Mhm,
have rebates for putting more insulation in, getting energy efficient appliances, getting high efficiency heat pump and high efficiency. It's in and just your thermal, your whole the thermal structure of your building. We don't have that. So it's and so you have high bills, and then your electricity rates keep going up, and it's energy efficiency is the cheapest way to go in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also improving the quality of life for people. This is your house is more comfortable to live in if it's properly insulated. But we have nothing, and there's so many states that are the number one state in the ACEEE rankings this year was kind of rotates among Massachusetts and New York and California, Oregon and Washington, but really aggressive energy efficiency programs, and it makes a huge difference.
So can you tell us more about your book, The Coal Trap?
Like I mentioned before, it's kind of the working title was The Lost Decade, as it focuses on that 10 years between 2009 and 2019. I got to the state in West Virginia in 2011, and just the failure of political leaders to recognize and help manage the state through this inevitable energy transition. I mean, once we started fracking, the hydraulic fracturing and the horizontal drilling, once that started getting scaled up in a big way, which happened around 2009, that was a game changer for the coal industry. Coal plants were out of the money in terms of our competitive wholesale market. It just cost more to generate with coal than with natural gas, and it was never going to change. It was never going to go back in terms of how those numbers looked for coal. And then later on in that decade, we had energy efficiency. Wind and solar became cheaper, and lots of utilities were finding it was cheaper to build new wind and solar than to continue running existing coal plants. And so the fundamental transformation in the energy industry occurred during that 10-year period. And in West Virginia, for the first part of that decade, we blamed it all on Obama's job killing EPA. It was a president who decided to go after greenhouse gases. EPA was the problem. The argument was that that's what was killing the coal industry. It was environmental regulations. And it turned out, the chief cause of the demise of the coal industry was cheap natural gas. And later on in the decade, cheap renewables. And the EPA had very little to do with it, but it allowed our politicians to totally abdicate their responsibility to manage the state through an energy transition and just blame it all on Washington, D.C. So we lost that 10 years. I think we're finally starting to have those discussions now. We're finally starting to take advantage of transition programs. But for most of that 10-year period, you couldn't really get any traction talking about a transition because we had our political leaders misleading the public and saying, oh, the coal jobs aren't going away. They're coming back. Or Donald Trump says the coal jobs are coming back. Our governor was reelected on a platform in 2020 of Jim Justice. He never gave up on coal. I mean, so you had our political leaders talking about everything's fine in the coal industry if the EPA would just leave us alone. And so it's just a lot of it's just the failure of other institutions in West Virginia to really protect the citizens, like the Public Service Commission not requiring utilities to look at other resources to hold electricity prices down. You had the Department of Environmental Protection, who's charged with administering the Surface Mining Reclamation and Control Act, in other words, making sure that there's enough money to clean up after these coal mines once they've ceased operation. But if you don't get enough money, then we're going to be left with hundreds of acres of unreclaimed mine land, which is what we have in West Virginia right now because our environmental regulators did not do the job to make sure that there were the resources to clean up the mess that the coal mines created. And that's just another example of just a failure of the state to, they put the coal industry ahead of the citizens of West Virginia, frankly, almost at every step of the way. And so we're not well positioned to take advantage of the clean energy economy in terms of still this heavy dependence on coal. Our electricity prices are growing very rapidly. The job creators who want access to renewable energy because they have corporate sustainability goals, they're reluctant to come to West Virginia because we have expensive electricity now and 91% coal-fired electricity. So your job creators aren't going to be expanding or relocating facilities in West Virginia because we don't have what they need. That's what I spent a lot of time in the book. And of course, the final chapter is just recommendations going forward. What can we do to position the state better going forward to take advantage of the opportunities that are there in the clean energy economy?
So from what you just said, what I can get is like the book really educates people on the current status of the energy industry in West Virginia and actually gives recommendation of how you can move further. So
yes,
what's your vision for like the book? Like, what if someone picks it up, what do you really hope they take and act on?
Well, the big takeaway is political leadership that acknowledges we have a transition that's inevitable and it's occurring whether we agree with it or not. There's a lot of public policy measures like adopting a clean energy standard to encourage decarbonization, to adopt an energy efficiency portfolio standard, to basically encourage scaling up of energy efficiency programs. The job retraining is a huge thing. The just transition, the need to retrain fossil fuel workers. And there's a lot of steps that can be taken, but and I cite a couple of examples of like city of Pittsburgh, for example, in the 1990s. Their civic leaders stepped up and realized the future is not in coal and steel, and they just charted a different future for the city, and they did some amazing work in positioning Pittsburgh going forward. It's a great city with lots of opportunities in high tech and healthcare and education, and they've transformed themselves. But it took the leaders in the 1990s to step up and say, coal and steel are over. We need to figure out a different future. And in Eastern Kentucky, Steve Beshear, who was a Democratic governor, and then Hal Rogers was a Republican congressman, chair of the Appropriations Committee. In 2012, they started this organization, Shaping Our Appalachian Region, SOAR. And they pretty much said in Eastern Kentucky, the coal fields are not going to be the future. We have to figure out a different path. And you had political leaders that stepped up and did that. And that's what we're missing in West Virginia. We're finally starting to see it, I think, now. Senator Manchin and Senator Capito are starting to bring home those federal programs to West Virginia that will really help. But that's why I fell back on the lost decade. This should have been done 10 years ago, because the writing was on the wall. It was very clear in 2009 that the future of the coal industry was a dismal one. They told the people what they thought they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to hear, and just completely abandoned their responsibility to manage the state through the transition.
Yeah. So how can we access your book if we want it?
It's available on Amazon. It's available on Barnes & Noble. Any independent bookstore will probably be able to get it for you. It's like I say, it's Cambridge University Press. It just came out in July of 2022. Sorry, just a few months ago.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, Professor James. It was really nice having you on here and like discussing this clean energy revolution. My audience thanks you too, because I know they've gained a lot. I'll be leaving all of his details down in the description.
Okay.
Link to the book and your LinkedIn. Yeah, I'll leave your link in case they need to contact you. So yeah, that will be the end. And I'll see you guys in my next episode. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to the Sustainability Nuggets podcast. I am Rarsu Maribi.
And I am Tosin Folorunsho. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating and review on wherever you listen to your podcast.
You can also show your support by signing up for a small donation to help sustain future episodes. You can find all relevant links in the description. See you in our next episode.